Chapter 6. The next day, Mrs. Hubbard woke with a sense of relief. A silly girl had been responsible for the recent events, and now there was order again. Going down to breakfast, however, her new sense of peace was destroyed. "Is it true, Ma," said Len Bateson, "that it's Celia who's been taking those things? Is that why she was not at breakfast?" "I'm not really surprised," said Sally. "I always had a sort of idea." "Are you saying that it was Celia who threw ink on my notes?" Elizabeth looked shocked. "Celia did not throw ink on your work," said Mrs. Hubbard. "And I wish you would all stop discussing this. I meant to tell you all later, but Jean was listening outside the door last night," said Valerie. "I was not listening. I just happened to go—"
"Come now, Elizabeth," said Nigel. "You know very well who threw the green ink. I did, of course."
"He didn't," said Patricia. "He's only pretending. Nigel, how can you be so stupid?"
"I'm being kind to you, Pat. Who borrowed my ink yesterday morning? You did."
"I do not understand, please," said Mr. Akibombo. "You don't want to," Sally said. Colin McNab had been trying to speak for some time. Now he hit the table hard with his hand, and suddenly everyone was silent.
"Don't any of you know anything about psychology? Celia's been going through a very difficult time, and she needs treating with kindness, not all this nonsense."
"I quite agree about being kind," said Jean, "but we should not encourage stealing."
"This wasn't stealing," said Colin. "You make me sick, all of you."
"Interesting case, is she, Colin?" said Valerie, and smiled at him.
"If you're interested in the workings of the mind, yes."
"I would like to make a formal protest," said Mr. Chandra Lal, an Indian student who also lived in the hostel. "Boracic powder, very necessary for my eyes, was taken." "Please," said Mr. Akibombo. "I still do not understand." "Come along," said Sally. "I'll tell you about it on the way to the college." She guided him out of the room and was followed by the other students. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Hubbard. "Why did I ever take this job on?" Valerie, who was the only person left, smiled. "Don't worry, Ma. It's a good thing it's all come out. Everyone was getting very anxious. I must say I was very surprised. That it was Celia? I thought it was rather obvious, really." "Have you always thought that?" "Well, one or two things made me wonder. Anyway, she's got Colin where she wants him." As Valerie went out, Mrs. Hubbard heard her saying cheerfully in the hall, "Good morning, Celia. All is known, and all is going to be forgiven." Celia came into the dining room, her eyes red from crying. "You're very late," Mrs. Hubbard said. "The coffee's cold, and there's not much left to eat. I didn't want to meet the others." "You've got to meet them sooner or later." "Oh, I know, but of course I'll leave at the end of the week." "You don't need to do that. but you'll have to pay for anything that you can't return." Celia interrupted her eagerly. "Oh, yes, I've got my cheque-book with me." It was in her hand with an envelope. "And I had written to you in case you weren't here, to say how sorry I was." "All right." Mrs. Hubbard looked at the list of objects. "It's difficult to say how much." "Well, let me give you a cheque for what you think, and then I can take some back or give you more later." Mrs. Hubbard suggested a sum, and Celia opened the cheque-book and started to write, then stopped. "Oh dear, my pen has no ink." She went over to the shelves, where there were various small things that belonged to the students. "There isn't any ink here either, except Nigel's awful green. Oh, I'll use that." She filled the pen and wrote out the cheque. Then she looked at her watch. "I shall be late. I'd better not stop for breakfast." "Now, you should have something, Celia." "Yes, what is it?" Geronimo, the Italian manservant, had come into the room. "Mrs. Nicoletti's. She has just come in. She wants to see you. She is very angry." "I'm coming." Mrs. Hubbard left the room while Celia began cutting off a piece of bread. Mrs. Nicolettis was walking up and down her room, and turned when she heard Mrs. Hubbard come in. "You sent for the police, without a word to me? Who do you think you are?" "I did not send for the police." "You are not telling the truth." "Mrs. Nicolettis, you can't talk to me like that." "Oh, no. Of course, it is I who am wrong, not you. Always me. Everything you do is perfect. Police in my respectable hostel." "But no one has called in the police. A famous private detective had dinner here last night. He gave a very interesting talk to the students." "Yes, and you told this detective friend of yours all about our most private matters. That is a great breaking of trust." "Not at all. I'm responsible for this place, and I'm glad to tell you that one of the students has admitted that she has been responsible for most of these things." "What is the good of that? My beautiful student's home will now have a bad name. No one will come." Mrs. Nicolettis sat down on the sofa and began to cry. "Nobody thinks of my feelings. If I died tomorrow, who would care?" Wisely leaving this question unanswered, Mrs. Hubbard left the room. She then put notes in all the students' rooms, explaining that Celia wished to pay them for anything they had lost. As she came down to dinner, Len Bateson stopped her. "I'll wait for Celia out in the hall and bring her in, so that she knows everything is all right." "That's very nice of you, Len." So, as soup was being passed round, Len's voice was heard from the hall. "Come along in, Celia. All friends here." Nigel remarked sharply to his soup plate, "So, he's done his good job for the day." But he waved to Celia as she came in with Len's arm round her. And there was a general sound of cheerful conversation. Colin McNabb came in late and seemed quieter than usual. When the meal was nearly finished, he got up and said, "I've got to go out and see someone, but I would like to tell you all first. Celia and I hope to get married next year when I've done my course." He immediately received good wishes and jokes from his friends, and finally escaped. "I'm so glad, Celia," said Patricia. "I hope you'll be very happy." "Everything is now perfect," said Nigel. "Why is dear Jean looking so serious? Do you disapprove of marriage, Jean?" "Of course not." "I always think it's so much better than free love, don't you? Nicer for the children. Looks better on their passports." Elizabeth Johnston said suddenly, "I would still like to talk about what happened yesterday." Valerie said, "What's the matter, Elizabeth?" "Oh, please," said Celia, "I really think that if the person who threw the ink on your papers and cut up that rucksack admits it, like I've done, then everything will be all right." Valerie said with a short laugh, "And we'll all live happily ever after." They all got up and went into the common room. There was some competition to give Celia her coffee. Then, finally, everyone living in 24 and 26 Hickory Road went to bed. Chapter 7. Miss Lemon was rarely, if ever, late. Storms, illness, transport failure, none of these things seemed to affect her. But this morning, Miss Lemon arrived, breathless, at 5 minutes past 10, instead of at 10 o'clock. "I'm extremely sorry, Monsieur Poirot. I was just about to leave the flat when my sister rang up, very upset. One of the students has committed suicide." "What is the name of the student?" "A girl called Celia Austin." "How?" "They think she took morphia." "Could it have been an accident?" "Oh, no. She left a note." Poirot said softly, "It was not this I expected, no. And yet it is true I expected something." He looked at Miss Lemon. "Please answer what letters you can. Me, I will go round to Hickory Road." Geronimo let Poirot in. "Sir, we have here bigger trouble. The girl, she is dead in her bed this morning. First the doctor came. Now comes an inspector of the police. He is upstairs with Mrs. Hubbard. Why would she wish to kill herself when last night she was engaged to be married?" "Engaged?" Yes, to Mr. Colin." Geronimo opened the door of the common room for Poirot. "You stay here, yes? When the police go, I will tell Mrs. Hubbard you are here." Upstairs, Mrs. Hubbard was with Inspector Sharp, who was asking questions. He was a big, comfortable-looking man, with a gentle manner that hid his determination. "There will have to be an inquest," he said. "So we must get the facts right. Now, this girl had been unhappy lately, you say?" "Yes." "Love affair?" Not exactly.
Mrs. Hubbard paused. You think perhaps she had a reason for killing herself?
Inspector Sharp, the girl had done some very stupid things, but—
Yes?
Well, for 3 months things have been disappearing. Small things, I mean. Nothing important, no money.
And this girl was responsible?
Yes. The night before last, a friend of mine came to dinner. A Monsieur Hercule Poirot, perhaps you know the name?
Inspector Sharp's eyes opened rather wide. Monsieur Hercule Poirot? Now, that's very interesting.
He gave us a little talk after dinner, and we discussed the fact that things had been stolen. He advised me, in front of them all, to go to the police.
He did he?
Afterwards, Celia came to my room and admitted everything. She was very upset.
Were you going to tell the police?
No. She was going to pay for everything, and everyone was very nice to her about it.
Was she short of money?
No. She had a job as a pharmacist at St. Catherine's Hospital, and a little money of her own. It was kleptomania, I suppose, said Mrs. Hubbard. You see, there was a young man she was fond of.
And he ended their relationship?
Oh, no. The complete opposite. He defended her very strongly, and last night he told us that they were now engaged to be married.
Inspector Sharp looked very surprised. And then she goes to bed and takes morphia?
I can't understand it.
Mrs. Hubbard shook her head. And yet the facts are clear. Sharp looked at the small, torn piece of paper on the table. Dear Mrs. Hubbard, I really am sorry, and this is the best thing I can do. It's not signed, but you are sure it's her handwriting?
Yes. But Mrs. Hubbard was worried. Why did she feel so strongly that there was something wrong about it?
There's one clear fingerprint on it which is definitely hers, said the inspector. The morphia was in a small bottle with the label of St. Catherine's Hospital on it, so she probably brought it home with her yesterday in order to commit suicide.
I really can't believe that. She was so happy last night.
Well, perhaps her mood changed when she went up to bed. Perhaps there was more in her past than you know about. This young man of hers, what's his name?
Colin McNabb. He's doing a psychology course at St. Catherine's. Celia was very much in love with him. More, I think, than he was with her.
That probably explains things. She hadn't told him everything she should have. Young people are very romantic and sometimes expect too much of love affairs. He stood up. Thank you, Mrs. Hubbard. Her mother died 2 years ago, and the only relative is an elderly aunt. We'll contact her.
He picked up the small piece of paper with Celia's writing on it. There's something wrong about that, said Mrs. Hubbard suddenly.
Wrong? In what way?
I don't know, but I feel I should know. Oh dear, I feel so stupid this morning.
It's all been very difficult for you.
Inspector Sharp opened the door and immediately fell over Geronimo, who was pressed against it. "Hello," he said. "Listening at doors, eh?" No, I do not listen, never. I'm just coming in with a message." "I see. What message?" "There is gentleman downstairs to see Mrs. Hubbard." "All right. Go in and tell her." The inspector walked down the passage and then paused as he heard Geronimo say, "The gentleman with the moustache, he is waiting to see you." "Gentleman with the moustache, eh?" said Sharp to himself, and went downstairs and into the common room. "Hello, Monsieur Poirot. It's a long time since we met." Calmly, Poirot turned from where he had been examining a bookshelf near the fireplace. "Surely, yes, it is Inspector Sharp, is it not? But you did not work in this part of London?" "I moved here 2 years ago. So I would like to know why you came along here the other night to give a talk on criminology to students." Poirot smiled. "But Mrs. Hubbard here is the sister of my wonderful secretary, Miss Lemon. So when she asked me—" "When she asked you to investigate what had been going on here, you came along. That's it, really, isn't it?" "You are correct." "But why? A silly girl taking a few things? Why did that interest you, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot shook his head. "It is not so simple as that." "Why not? I don't understand," Sharp said. "No, and I do not understand. The things that were taken, they did not make a pattern. They did not make sense. And other things happened that were meant to fit in with the pattern of Celia Austin, but they did not fit in. They were meaningless, and some were even cruel. But Celia was not cruel." "She was a kleptomaniac?" "I very much doubt it. It is my opinion that stealing these cheap objects was to attract the attention of a certain young man." "Colin McNab?" "Yes. She was in love with Colin McNab, who never noticed her. So instead of being a pretty, well-behaved girl, she became a young criminal. Colin McNab was immediately interested in her." "He must be very stupid." "Not at all. He is a keen psychologist." "Oh, one of those. I understand now." Inspector Sharp smiled. "So, the girl was rather clever." "Surprisingly so, and I think the idea had been suggested to her by someone else." "But still," said Sharp, "I don't understand. If this kleptomania business was successful, why did she commit suicide?" "The answer is that she did not commit suicide. Are you quite sure that she did?" "It's obvious, Monsieur Poirot, and—" The door opened, and Mrs. Hubbard came in looking very pleased with herself. "I've got it. It came to me suddenly. Why that suicide note looked wrong, I mean. Celia couldn't possibly have written it." "Why not, Mrs. Hubbard?" asked Sharp. "Because it's written in blue-black ink. And Celia filled her pen with green ink, that ink over there, at breakfast time yesterday morning." She went to the shelf and held up the nearly empty bottle. "I am sure that the piece of paper was torn out of the letter she wrote to me yesterday, and which I never opened."
"What did she do with it? Can you remember?"
Mrs. Hubbard shook her head. "I left her alone in here, and she must have just forgotten about it."
"And somebody found it and opened it. Somebody—" The inspector paused. "You understand what this means? Somebody saw the possibility of using the opening words of her letter to you to suggest something very different. To suggest suicide. So this means—"
"Murder," said Hercule Poirot. Chapter 8. It was 5 o'clock, and Inspector Sharp was drinking his third cup of tea.
"Thank you for inviting me to your home, Monsieur Poirot. I've got an hour to wait until the students get back to the house so that I can question them all."
"You have been to St. Catherine's Hospital?" Poirot asked.
"Yes, the chief pharmacist was very helpful."
"What did he say about the girl?"
"She had worked there for just over a year, and everyone liked her." He paused. "The morphia certainly came from there."
"It did? That is interesting, and rather strange."
"It was morphine tartrate, and was kept in the poison cupboard on the upper shelf, amongst drugs that were not often used."
"So, if one small bottle disappeared, it would not immediately be noticed?"
"That's right. The 3 pharmacists all had keys to the poison cupboard, but on a busy day someone is going to it every few minutes. Therefore the cupboard is unlocked and remains unlocked till the end of work."
"What outsiders come into the pharmacy?"
"Quite a lot of people go through the pharmacy to get to the chief pharmacist's office, and salesmen from big drug companies go through it too. Then, of course, friends come in sometimes to see one of the pharmacists."
"Who came in recently to see Celia Austin?"
Sharp looked at his notebook. "A girl called Patricia Lane came on Tuesday last week. She wanted Celia to meet her at the cinema after the pharmacy closed."
"Patricia Lane," said Poirot thoughtfully.
"She was only there for about 5 minutes and did not go near the poison cupboard. They also remember a West Indian girl coming about 2 weeks ago. She was interested in the work and asked questions about it and made notes."
"That must be Elizabeth Johnston. Anyone else?"
"Not that the other pharmacists can remember."
"Do doctors come to the pharmacy?"
Sharp smiled. "All the time. Sometimes to ask about a particular drug. Sometimes they just come in for a talk to the girls. And a lot of young fellows come in for pills because they've been drinking too much."
Poirot said, "And if I remember rightly, one or more of the students at Hickory Road is studying at St. Catherine's. A big, red-haired boy, Bateman."
"Leonard Bateson, that's right. And Colin McNabb is doing a course there. Then there's a girl, Jean Tomlinson, who works in the physiotherapy department."
And all of these have probably been quite often in the pharmacy.
Yes, and nobody remembers when because they're so used to seeing them.
It is not easy, said Poirot.
No, it is not.
Sharp paused.
You said this morning that someone might have suggested the kleptomania idea to Celia Austin. If so, who?
Only 3 of the students, I believe, would have been able to think of such an idea. Leonard Bateson might have suggested kleptomania to Celia almost as a joke, but I do not really think he would have allowed such a thing to go on for so long. Nigel Chapman is a humorous and slightly cruel character. He would think it good fun and would not care if things went wrong. The third person is a young woman called Valerie Hobhouse. She is clever and has probably read enough psychology to judge Colin's probable reaction.
Thanks, said Sharp, writing down the names. And is that all the help you can give me, Monsieur Poirot?
I fear so, but I shall continue to be interested and do what I can. For me, there is only one method.
And that is?
Conversation, my friend. Conversation and again conversation. All the murderers I have ever met enjoyed talking. They are so pleased with themselves that sooner or later they say something that shows they know too much about the crime.
Sharp stood up. I suppose every single one of the students is a possible murderer?
I think so,
said Poirot lightly.
Chapter 9. Inspector Sharp leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. He had interviewed a tearful French girl, the gentle Mr. Akibombo, and several other foreign students who did not really understand what he was saying. None of these, he was certain, knew anything about the death of Celia Austin. His next interview was with Nigel Chapman, who immediately took control of the conversation.
Of course, I had an idea that you'd got it wrong when you thought it was suicide, but it rather pleases me that you suddenly saw it in a new way, because she filled her pen with my green ink. The one thing the murderer couldn't possibly have expected. I suppose you've thought carefully about what can be the motive for this crime?
I'm asking the questions, Mr. Chapman, said Inspector Sharp.
Oh, of course, said Nigel. I was trying to go directly to the important points, but I suppose we've got to go through all the usual boring questions. Name, Nigel Chapman, age 25, I'm studying history at London University. Anything else you want to know?
What is your home address, Mr. Chapman?
No home address. I have a father, but he and I have quarrelled, and his address is therefore no longer mine. So 26 Hickory Road and Coots Bank will always find me.
Inspector Sharp did not react to Nigel's behaviour. He suspected that it hid his nervousness of being questioned about a murder.
"How well did you know Celia Austin?" he asked. "I knew her very well in the sense that I saw her almost every day, but in fact I didn't know her at all. I wasn't interested in her, and I think she probably disapproved of me." "Did she disapprove of you for any particular reason?" "She didn't like my sense of humour." "When was the last time you saw Celia Austin?" "At dinner yesterday evening, when Colin told us they were engaged." "Was that at dinner or in the common room?" "At dinner. Afterwards, when we went into the common room, Colin went off somewhere." "And the rest of you had coffee in the common room?" "Yes." "Did Celia Austin have coffee?" "Well, I suppose so. I mean, I didn't actually notice her having coffee, but she must have had it." "You did not personally hand her some coffee?" "Are you trying to suggest something, Mr. Sharp?" "Well, I didn't go near her. I've never been attracted to Celia, and her engagement to Colin McNab caused no murderous feelings in me." "I'm not suggesting anything like that, Mr. Chapman," said Sharp. "But somebody wanted Celia Austin dead. Why?" "I can't imagine why, Inspector. Celia was such a boring girl, but very nice. Not at all the type to get herself murdered." "Were you surprised when you found that it was Celia who had been stealing things here?" "Very." "You didn't perhaps encourage her to take those things?" "Me? Why would I? And surely, Inspector, the reason was psychological." "Do you think that Celia Austin was a kleptomaniac?" "What other explanation can there be?" "You don't think that someone might have suggested it to Miss Austin as a way of, say, making Mr. McNab look at her in a new way?" Nigel's eyes shone. "Now that really is a most interesting explanation. And it's perfectly possible, because of course Colin would react like that." "Have you any ideas, Mr. Chapman, about the things that have been going on in this house? About, for example, the throwing of ink over Miss Johnston's papers?" "If you're thinking I did it, Inspector, that's quite untrue. Of course, it looks like me because of the green ink. But if you ask me, somebody used my ink to make it look like me." The next person on Inspector Sharp's list was Leonard Bateson. He was even more uncomfortable than Nigel, though it showed in a different way. "All right," he shouted after the first few questions. "I poured out Celia's coffee and gave it to her, and you can believe it or not, but there was no morphia in it." "You saw her drink it?" "No. We were all moving around, and I got into an argument with someone just after that." "So you are saying that anybody could have dropped morphia into her coffee cup?" "No. You try to put anything in anyone's cup. Everybody would see you." "Would they?" said Sharp. Len shouted, "Why do you think I would want to poison the girl? I liked her. She must have taken it herself. There's no other explanation." "We might think so if it wasn't for the false suicide note." "False? She wrote it, didn't she?" "She wrote it as part of a letter early that morning." "Well, she could have torn a bit out and used it as a suicide note." "Really, Mr. Bateson, if you wanted to write a suicide note, you would write one. You wouldn't take a letter you had written to somebody else and carefully tear out one particular bit.
I might do. People do all sorts of strange things.
So, did you believe Celia when she said she had stolen the things in the house?
Of course. But it did seem strange. She didn't seem to be the type to be a kleptomaniac, nor a thief either.
And you can't think of any other reason for her having done it?
What other reason could there be?
Well, she might have wanted to make Colin McNab interested in her.
Len shook his head. She wouldn't have been able to plan a thing like that. She didn't have the knowledge.
You've got the knowledge, though, haven't you?
Len gave a short laugh. You think I would do a stupid thing like that? You're mad. The inspector changed direction.
Do you think that Celia Austin spilled the ink over Elizabeth Johnston's papers? Or do you think someone else did it?
Someone else. Celia said she didn't do that, and I believe her. She never got annoyed with Elizabeth, not like some people did.
Who got annoyed with her, and why?
She criticised people, you know. Len paused. Anyone who said something without really thinking. She would look across the table and say something like, "I'm afraid that is not proved by the facts. It has been well established by mathematics that—" Well, it was annoying. Especially to Nigel, for example.
Ah, yes. Nigel Chapman.
And it was green ink, too.
So you think it was Nigel who did it?
Well, it's possible.
Can you think of anybody else who Elizabeth Johnston annoyed?
Well, Colin McNab wasn't too pleased now and again, nor was Jean Tomlinson.
Sharp saw Valerie Hobhouse next. Valerie was cool and stylish. She seemed much less nervous than either of the men. She had been fond of Celia, she said. Celia was not very clever, and it was rather sad the way she so loved Colin McNab. Do you think she was a kleptomaniac, Miss Hobhouse?
Well, I suppose so. I don't really know much about the subject.
Do you think anyone had encouraged her to do what she did?
You mean in order to attract Colin?
You're very quick on the point, Miss Hobhouse. Yes, that's what I mean. You didn't suggest it to her, perhaps?
Valerie smiled. Well, no. Considering that a favourite scarf of mine was cut to pieces, I'm not as kind as that.
Do you think anyone else suggested it to her?
No, I think it was just natural behaviour.
What do you mean by natural?
Well, I first suspected that it was Celia when Sally's shoe went missing. Celia was jealous of Sally. She's easily the most attractive girl here, and Colin gave her a lot of attention. So, on the night of this party, Sally's shoe disappeared, and she had to go in an old black dress and black shoes. And there was Celia, looking as pleased as a cat that swallowed the cream. But I didn't suspect her of taking all these other things, like bracelets and compacts.
Who did you think took those?
Valerie shook her head. Oh, I don't know. One of the cleaning women, I thought.
And the rucksack that was cut up?
Was there a rucksack taken? I had forgotten.
Miss Hobhouse, have you any ideas of your own about Celia Austen's death? Any idea of the motive for it?
Valerie's face was serious now. No. It was a horrible thing to happen. I can't think of anybody who wanted Celia to die. She was a nice girl, and she had just got engaged, and...
And?
I wondered if that was why, said Valerie slowly. Because she had got engaged. Because she was going to be happy. But that means somebody is, well, mad. Inspector Sharp looked at her thoughtfully.
Yes, madness is a possible reason. So, have you any theory about the ink on Elizabeth Johnston's papers?
I don't believe that Celia would do a thing like that.
Any idea who it could have been?
Well, not a reasonable idea.
But an unreasonable one?
Well, I've got a sort of idea that it was Patricia Lane.
Really? Now you do surprise me. Patricia Lane seems such a well-balanced young lady.
I'm not saying she did do it. I just think she might have.
Why?
Well, Patricia disliked Elizabeth because she was always criticising her beloved Nigel. You know, when he made silly statements the way he does.
You think it was more likely to have been Patricia rather than Nigel himself?
Oh, yes. Nigel wouldn't bother, and he would certainly not use his own special ink.
Then it might be somebody who did not like Nigel Chapman and wanted to make people think that he did it. Who does dislike him?
Oh, well, Jean Tomlinson does. And Nigel and Len Bateson often quarrel with each other.
Have you any ideas, Miss Hobhouse, how morphia could have been given to Celia Austen?
I suppose the coffee is the most obvious way. We were all moving around in the common room. Celia's coffee was on a small table near her, and she always waited until it was nearly cold before she drank it. Anybody could have dropped a pill or something into her cup.
The morphia, said Inspector Sharp, was in the form of a powder.
Oh, that would be rather more difficult, wouldn't it?
Can you describe to me exactly what happened that evening in the common room?
Well, we all sat about, talked. Most of the boys went out. Celia went up to bed rather early, and so did Jean Tomlinson. Sally and I stayed there rather late. I was writing letters, and Sally was reading some notes. I think I was the last to go up to bed.
Thank you, Miss Hobhouse. Will you send Miss Lane to me now?
Patricia Lane looked worried but not frightened, and she told the inspector nothing very new. When he asked her about Elizabeth Johnston's papers, Patricia said that she was sure that Celia had thrown the ink on them.
But she said she didn't, Miss Lane.
Well, of course she would. But it fits in, doesn't it, with all the other things?
Do you know what I think about this case, Miss Lane? That nothing fits in very well.
I suppose, said Patricia, "that you think it was Nigel who did it, because of the ink. That's such nonsense. I mean, Nigel wouldn't have used his own ink if he had done a thing like that. But anyway, he wouldn't do it."
"He didn't always get on very well with Miss Johnston, did he?"
"Oh, she could be annoying sometimes, but he didn't really mind." Patricia Lane leaned forward. "I would like to try to make you understand some things about Nigel, Inspector. I'm the first to admit that he's got a very difficult manner. It turns people against him. He's rude and makes fun of people, but really, he's very different from what he seems. He's one of those shy, rather unhappy people who really want to be liked, but who, for some reason, find themselves saying and doing the opposite to what they mean to say and do."
"Ah," said Inspector Sharp. "Rather unfortunate, that."
"Yes, but it comes from having had an unfortunate childhood. Nigel's father was very hard and never understood him. He treated his mother very badly too. After she died, they had a big quarrel, and Nigel left the house, and his father said that he would never give him any help or money. Nigel said he didn't want anything from his father, and he never went near him again. Since his mother died, he's never had anyone to care for him. He has a wonderful mind, but just can't show himself as he really is." Inspector Sharp looked at her thoughtfully.
"In love with the fellow," he thought.
He wondered if Nigel Chapman had been attracted to Celia Austin. If so, Patricia Lane might have disliked her a lot. Disliked her enough to murder her? Surely not. And of course, the fact that Celia had got engaged to Colin McNab would surely destroy that as a possible motive. He thanked Patricia Lane and asked for Jean Tomlinson. Chapter 10. Jean Tomlinson was a severe-looking young woman with fair hair and a rather tight mouth. She sat down. "How can I help you, Inspector? It was bad enough when we thought Celia had committed suicide, but now that it's supposed to be murder—" She stopped and shook her head.
"Do you know where the poison came from?"
said Sharp. Jean nodded. "I hear it came from St. Catherine's Hospital, but that makes it seem more like suicide."
"It was probably intended to. I hear that you often visited the pharmacy, Miss Tomlinson."
"I went in there to see my friend Mildred, one of the other pharmacists, yes. But I would never have gone to the poison cupboard."
"But you could have done so."
"That is a disgusting accusation, Inspector Sharp."
"But it's not an accusation, Miss Tomlinson. I'm just saying that it was possible for you to go to the poison cupboard. I'm not saying that you did so. I mean, why would you?"
"Exactly. I was a friend of Celia's."
"People do sometimes get poisoned by their friends. Did you suspect it was Celia who had stolen the things in the house?"
"No. I always thought Celia had high principles."
"Of course," said Sharp. "Kleptomaniacs can't really help themselves, can they?"
Jean Tomlinson paused. "I can't agree with that idea. Stealing is stealing. People should be punished for these things."
"But instead, Everything was ending happily, and Miss Austen was getting married.
"One isn't surprised at anything Colin McNab does," said Jean. "He isn't religious, and my opinion is that he's a communist. He supported Celia because he thinks everyone should just take anything they want."
What about the ink on Elizabeth Johnston's papers? Did she do that?
"It does seem unlikely."
You think it was Nigel Chapman?
"No, I don't think Nigel would do that either. I think it was probably Mr. Akibombo."
Really? Why would he do it?
"Jealousy, because Elizabeth is so clever." Inspector Sharp thought for a moment.
When was the last time you saw Celia Austen?
"After dinner on Friday night."
Who went up to bed first, she or you?
"I did."
And you've no idea who could have put morphia into her coffee, if it was given that way?
"No idea at all."
You never saw morphia anywhere in the house?
"No, I don't think so."
You don't think so, Miss Tomlinson?
"Well, I just wondered. There was that silly bet."
What bet?
"Oh, some of the boys were arguing. Colin and Nigel started it, and then Len joined in, and Patricia was there too."
What were they arguing about?
"Murder, and ways of doing it."
Really? Can you remember what was said?
Jean Tomlinson considered. "Well, it started with the discussion on murder by using poison. They said that the difficulty was to obtain the poison, that the murderer was usually found because of where he bought poison or because he had an opportunity to get it. But Nigel said that he could think of 3 ways by which anyone could obtain a poison and nobody would ever know. Len Bateson said that he was talking nonsense. Nigel said no he wasn't and he would prove it. Pat said that Nigel was right and that either Len or Colin could probably get poison any time they liked from a hospital, and so could Celia. And Nigel said that wasn't what he meant at all. He said that he, who wasn't a doctor or pharmacist, could get 3 different types of poison by 3 different methods. Len Bateson said, "All right then, but what are your methods?" And Nigel said, "I won't tell you now, but I bet you that within 3 weeks I can produce 3 deadly poisons here." And Len Bateson said he would bet him £5 he couldn't do it.
Well, what happened?
Said Inspector Sharp. "Nothing for some time, and then, one evening in the common room, Nigel said, 'Look here, I did it.' And he put 3 things on the table: a tube of hyoscine pills, a bottle of digitalis, and a tiny bottle of morphine." The inspector said sharply, "Morphine? Any label on it?" "Yes, it had St. Catherine's Hospital on it."
"And the others?"
"I don't think they were from hospitals."
What happened next?
"Well, Len Bateson said, 'But if you had committed a murder, this would soon lead to you.' And Nigel said, 'No, it wouldn't. I have no connection with any hospital, and nobody will connect me with these.' Well, they argued a bit, but in the end, Len said he would pay the £5. He then said, "What are we going to do with the poisons?" Nigel said we'd better get rid of them before any accidents happened, so they threw the pills and the morphine on the fire. The digitalis they poured down the lavatory. And the bottles? I don't know what happened to the bottles. And this all happened when? Just over 2 weeks ago, I think. Inspector Sharp remained thinking for a while after she had gone. Then he asked Nigel Chapman in again. "I've just had a rather interesting statement from Miss Tomlinson," he said. "Ah, who's dear Jean been poisoning your mind against? Me?" "She's been talking about poison, and in connection with you, Mr. Chapman. I hear that you had a bet with Mr. Bateson about 3 methods of obtaining poison." "Oh, that!" Nigel smiled. "Yes, of course. I don't even remember Jean being there." "You admit it, then?" "Oh, yes. Colin and Len were being rather annoying, so—" "So what were your 3 methods, Mr. Chapman?" Nigel leant his head on one side. "Aren't you asking me to incriminate myself?" "You can refuse to answer my questions, if you like." Nigel considered for a moment, a slight smile on his lips. "Of course, what I did was against the law. You could charge me for it. But if it's got any connection with poor little Celia's death, I suppose I should tell you." "That would certainly be the sensible decision." "All right, then. I'll talk." "What were these 3 methods?" "Well," Nigel leant back in his chair, "one's always reading in the papers about doctors losing dangerous drugs from a car. So I thought that one very simple method would be to go down to the country, follow a doctor about, and when the opportunity came, just open the car, look in the doctor's case, and take what you wanted. I had to follow 3 doctors until I found a suitably careless one. When I did, it was so easy. The car was left outside a farmhouse. I looked in the case, took out a tube of hyoscine, and that was that." "And method number 2? "That involved Celia, but she had no idea what I was doing. I just talked about the funny way doctors write prescriptions, and asked her to write one for me like a doctor would write it for digitalis. So she did. All I then had to do was to find a doctor living in another part of London, write his signature on the prescription so that it was hard to read, and take it to a chemist in another busy part of London. I received the medicine without any difficulty at all." "And the 3rd method?" "I am incriminating myself. I can hear it in your voice." "Stealing drugs from an unlocked car is larceny. Forging a prescription—" Nigel interrupted him. "But I didn't obtain money by it, and it wasn't a copy of any particular doctor's signature. Anyway, I'm only telling you because—" "Yes, Mr. Chapman?" Nigel said with sudden feeling, "Celia didn't deserve to be murdered, and I want to help." "Mr. Chapman, the police can choose how they treat some types of behaviour, so please, tell me about your 3rd method." "Well," said Nigel, "it was a bit more risky than the other 2, but it was also more fun. You see, I'd been to visit Celia before in her pharmacy. I knew the place reasonably well.
So you were able to take the bottle out of the cupboard?
No. If I'd been planning a real murder, someone would remember that I had been there. No, I knew that Celia always went into the back room at 11:15 for a cup of coffee. There was a new girl there, and she didn't know me, so with a white coat on and a stethoscope round my neck, I walked into the pharmacy when she was alone there. I went along to the poison cupboard, took out a bottle, then asked the girl if she had a couple of headache pills, as I had had too much to drink the night before. I swallowed them and walked out. She never suspected that I wasn't a doctor. It was so easy.
A stethoscope, said Inspector Sharp. Where did you get that?
Nigel smiled. It was Len Bateson's. You should have seen everyone's face when I put those 3 poisons on the table. But we got rid of all of them at least 2 weeks ago.
That is what you think, Mr. Chapman, but it may not really be so.
What do you mean?
How long had you had these things in your possession?
Well, the hyoscine about 10 days, the morphine about 4 days, the digitalis I had only got that afternoon.
And where did you keep these things?
In my chest of drawers, under my socks.
Did anyone know that?
No.
Did you tell anyone about what you were doing?
No. At least, no, I didn't.
You said, at least, Mr. Chapman?
Well, I was going to tell Pat. Then I thought she wouldn't approve, so I didn't. I told her after I'd got them. She was not amused. But we just threw it all on the fire and down the lavatory, with no harm done.
But it's very possible that harm was done. Have you never thought, Mr. Chapman, that someone might have seen where you put those things, and that someone might have emptied morphia out of the bottle and replaced it with something else?
Goodness, no. But nobody could possibly have known.
Which students might normally go into your room?
Well, I share it with Len Bateson. Most of the men here have been in it. Not the girls, of course. They're not allowed to come to the bedroom floors on our side of the house.
But they might still do so.
Anyone might, said Nigel. In the afternoon there's nobody about.
Does Miss Lane ever come to your room?
I hope you don't mean that the way it sounds, Inspector. Pat comes to my room sometimes to return some socks she's mended. That's all.
Leaning forward, Inspector Sharp said, You do see, Mr. Chapman, that the person who could most easily have taken some of that poison out of the bottle was yourself?
Nigel looked at him, his face suddenly very tired. Yes, I saw that just a minute and a half ago. But I had no reason to kill the girl, Inspector, and I didn't do it. Although you've only got my word for it. Chapter 11. Len Bateson and Colin McNabb both agreed that the story of the bet and the throwing away of the poison was true. Sharp kept Colin McNabb back after the others had gone.
I don't want to cause you any more pain than I can help, Mr. McNabb. You need not concern yourself with my feelings, said Colin, his face showing nothing. Just ask me any questions which you think may be useful to you. It was your opinion that Celia Austin's behaviour had a psychological origin? There's no doubt about it. Her childhood had been very difficult because— Yes, I'm sure. Inspector Sharp did not want to hear the story of yet another unhappy childhood. Nigel's had been enough. You had been attracted to her for some time? I would not say that, said Colin. Subconsciously, no doubt, but I was not aware of it. Had Celia any enemies here? No, Inspector. Celia was well liked. I do not think it was a personal matter, the reason she was killed. What do you mean by not a personal matter? I do not wish to say at the moment. I'm not clear about it myself. The inspector could not move him from that position. The last two students to be interviewed were Sally Finch and Elizabeth Johnston. Sally was an attractive girl with red hair and bright, intelligent eyes. After the usual questions, she said, "Inspector, I would like to tell you that I think there's something very wrong about this house." You mean you're afraid of something, Miss Finch? Sally nodded. Yes, the place isn't what it seems, and I'll bet you that awful old Mrs. Nicolettis knows about it. That's interesting. Can you be clearer? Sally shook her head. No, all I can tell you is that something unpleasant is going on here, Inspector. Other people feel it too. Akibombo does. He's frightened. I believe Elizabeth does, but she wouldn't say anything. And I think that Celia knew something about it. Knew something about what? There were things she said that last day about clearing everything up. She had admitted her part in what was going on, but I think she knew something about someone. That's the reason I think she was killed. But if it was something as serious as that— Sally interrupted him. I think she had no idea how serious it was. I see. Thank you. Now, the last time you saw Celia was in the common room after dinner last night? I saw her after that. When I went up to bed, she was going out of the front door. That's rather surprising. I think she was going to meet someone. Someone from outside, or one of the students? Well, I think that it was one of the students. Because if she wanted to speak to somebody privately, there was nowhere she could do it in the house. Do you know when she returned? No. Thank you, Miss Finch. Last of all, the inspector talked to Elizabeth Johnston. Celia Austin said that it was not she who damaged your papers. Do you believe her? I do not think Celia did it. No. You don't know who did? The obvious answer is Nigel Chapman, but it seems to me a little too obvious. Nigel is clever. He would not use his own ink. And if not Nigel, Who, then?
That is more difficult. But I think Celia knew who it was.
Did she tell you so?
Not really. But yesterday evening before dinner, she came to tell me that though she had stolen the things, she had not damaged my work. I said I believed her, then asked if she knew who had done so.
And what did she say?
She said...
Elizabeth paused a moment.
She said, I can't really be sure because I don't see why. It might have been a mistake or an accident. I'm sure whoever did it would really like to admit it. And there are some things I don't understand, like the light bulbs the day the police came.
What's this about the police and light bulbs?
I don't know. All Celia said was, I didn't take them out. And then she said, I wondered if it had anything to do with the passport. I said, what passport? And she said, I think someone might have a forged passport.
The inspector was silent. Here at last, a faint pattern seemed to be taking shape. A passport. What more did she say?
She just said, anyway, I shall know more about it tomorrow.
I shall know more about it tomorrow. That's a very interesting remark. The inspector was again silent as he considered. Before coming to Hickory Road with Sergeant Cobb, he had looked up the records. Hostels which housed foreign students were carefully watched. Number 26 Hickory Road had a good record. There had only been one inquiry, when there was a routine check of all hostels for a foreign student wanted for the murder of a woman near Cambridge. This had happened some time ago, and could not possibly have any connection with the death of Celia Austin. He looked up to see Elizabeth Johnston's dark, intelligent eyes watching him, and suddenly said, "Have you ever had a feeling that something was wrong about this place?" She looked surprised.
"In what way wrong?"
"I don't really know. I'm thinking of something Miss Finch said to me."
"Oh, Sally Finch. Americans are all the same, suspicious of everything."
The inspector's interest grew. So Elizabeth disliked Sally Finch. Why? Because Sally was an American? Or did Elizabeth dislike Americans just because Sally was an American? He said, "You understand, Miss Johnston, we just ask most people for facts. But when we meet someone with a high level of intelligence—" He paused. Would she respond? She did.
"What you want is the clarity of a trained mind."
Inspector Sharp nodded. "That's why I would value your opinion."
Elizabeth said, "Don't listen to Sally Finch, Inspector. This is a good, well-run hostel. I am certain that you will find no illegal political activities here."
Inspector Sharp was surprised. "It wasn't really political activities I was thinking about."
"Oh, I see."
She was a little confused.
"I was thinking of what Celia said about the passport. But I'm sure that the reason for Celia's death was a private one."
"I see."
Well, thank you, Miss Johnston. Inspector Sharp sat staring at the closed door, then turned to Sergeant Cobb. I'm coming back here tomorrow, Sergeant, with a search warrant. There's something going on in this place. Chapter 12. Hercule Poirot paused in the middle of a sentence that he was dictating and waved a hand.
This letter is not important. If you please, Miss Lemon, get me your sister on the telephone.
A few moments later, he took the receiver from his secretary's hand.
I trust, Mrs. Hubbard, that I am not disturbing you?
Not at all. I'm so glad you phoned, Monsieur Poirot.
There have been difficulties, yes?
That's a very nice way of saying it. Inspector Sharp came with a search warrant today, and I've got Mrs. Nicolettis here shouting at me.
I am sorry,
Poirot said.
It is just a little question I have to ask. You sent me a list of those things that had disappeared, but did you write that list in the order they were taken?
No, I'm sorry. I just wrote them down as I thought of them.
Would it be too difficult for you to remember and write what was the proper order?
Well, the rucksack, I believe, was the first, and the light bulbs, and then the bracelet and the compact. No, the evening shoe. Anyway, I'll do the best I can.
Thank you, madame.
Poirot hung up the phone.
I am displeased with myself, Miss Lemon. I forgot to employ my usual principles of order and method. I should have made quite sure from the start the exact sequence of these events.
On arrival back at Hickory Road with a search warrant, Inspector Sharp had demanded an interview with Mrs. Nicolettis, who always came on Saturdays to do the accounts. He had explained what he was about to do.
"But it is an insult, that,"
Mrs. Nicolettis said.
"My students, they will all leave. I shall be ruined."
"Madam, this is a murder case."
"It is not murder. It is suicide."
"So I'll start here in your sitting room."
"Here? No, I refuse,"
Mrs. Nicolettis shouted.
"I am above the law."
"No one is above the law, so please stand aside." He started with the desk. A large box of chocolates and a mass of papers were all he found. He moved from there to a cupboard. "This is locked. Can I have the key, please?"
"Never!"
shouted Mrs. Nicolettis.
"You will have to tear my clothes off me before you get the key."
"Get the tool, Cobb," said Inspector Sharp. Mrs. Nicolettis gave a cry of anger. Inspector Sharp took no notice. The tool was brought. 2 sharp cracks, and the door was open, and a large collection of empty brandy bottles poured out of the cupboard.
"Pig!"
cried Mrs. Nicolettis. "Thank you, madam," said the inspector. "We finished in here." One mystery, the mystery of Mrs. Nicolettis's moods, was now solved. Drink this," said Mrs. Hubbard, handing Mrs. Nicolettis a cup of tea, "and you'll soon feel better. There is nothing more to worry about now."
"That is all very well for you. Me, I have to worry. It is not safe for me any longer."
"Safe?" Mrs. Hubbard looked at her, surprised.
"It was my private cupboard,"
Mrs. Nicolettis insisted.
"Nobody knew what was in my private cupboard, and now they do know. They may think, oh, what will they think?"
"Who do you mean by they?" Mrs. Nicolettis shook her head.
"Thank goodness I do not sleep here."
Mrs. Hubbard said, "Mrs. Nicolettis, if you are afraid of something, wouldn't it be best to tell me what it is?" Mrs. Nicolettis gave her a quick look from her dark eyes.
"You have said yourself there has been a murder in this house. So who may be next?"
"Then tell me if you have any reason to be so anxious." Mrs. Nicolettis interrupted her.
"You are a spy. I always knew it. If lies are told about me, I shall know who told them."
"If you wish me to leave," said Mrs. Hubbard, "you only have to say so."
"No, you are not to leave. I will not allow it."
"Oh, all right," said Mrs. Hubbard. "But really, it's very difficult to know what you do want. Sometimes I don't think you know yourself what you want."